In this episode, I discuss what makes e-learning scenarios engaging and some fabulous highlights from a recent conference I presented at.
You're here because you want more engagement, more delight, more fun, more learning. You're hungry for change and willing to take action.
If you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original.
Welcome to the eLearning Scenario Design Podcast with Anna Sabramowitz.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
Let's take learning to the next level.
Hello and welcome back, my friend. How are you? I hope your day is going fantastic. And if not, then hopefully all of this amazing stuff I'm going to share with you today is going to make it so much better. Woo! So one of the things I wanted to share with you today is just this last week presenting at a conference, and it was a conference put on by Sprout Labs. It was a virtual learning conference. And it was absolutely fantabulous. I actually couldn't believe the turnout for the sessions. It was excellent. And what was also really wonderful is they used the Zoom platform, which I absolutely adore for its simplicity and for its ability to scale. I use it almost daily for all of my either client meetings, or I use it to facilitate large groups. And let me tell you, this tool I love it. Anyways, they're having a really awesome Zoom conference too, and they're having Serena Williams speak, which hopefully I can attend that because that would be super cool. Anyways, so the other thing that I absolutely loved about this, and the fact that Robin Pettert actually put it together and organized all of these human beings from all over the world, not only to present, but also to attend, and then also participate, which is what I absolutely love. Like, whenever you're having a session and you can't see people's faces, which is already hard, to get people to give you feedback in real time about what's going on, give you questions, and the caliber of the questions and the kinds of ideas that were coming through, I think it's just phenomenal. And as a result of that conversation as well, you really get to connect with people, and it's much more intimate, I find, than speaking in, a giant crowded room, which I've done, but it just feels like you can actually, be more dynamic with the conversation. So you don't okay, I'm going to talk for 45 minutes and at the end we're going to have some Q&A. That works, but there's this level of almost like equality and intimacy that happens in those rooms that makes it so possible for you to make real connections with people, I find. I know that's weird because we're in a virtual space, but I had so many people follow up with me afterwards, after the session, and I knew who they were because their names were attached to their comments, and they asked for, for recommendations, asked more questions, and also just connected with me on LinkedIn, which was just so cool because I don't think we realize how many different continents actually end up showing up in a single space. And I'm always amazed when people take the time to actually invest in themselves and show up to these events and learn. So in case you didn't register or you're waiting for the recording, which I totally understand because, we have lives too, then I thought I'd share some of the highlights with you of some of the things that I shared during this Learning While Working conference that Sprout Labs put on. So one of the things that I found was really interesting is that it's not that necessarily I'm into game mechanics or game, how games work and all those things. That's my focus is always going to be how to craft an awesome scenario. And what I feel my job is to do is to go out and look at other industries, other areas that are doing something that is working, and seeing how I can take those things and incorporate them into my work. And I find that when true innovation happens in any field, it only happens when somebody who is not from that world comes in and tries to integrate things that they learned in a different world that's working for a different world. So, one of the things that usually happens when we design something or when we look to designing something is we always look at what our peers are doing. And that's okay, but that kind of creates a, what do you call that? Inbreeding. So my goal is also, even during those conferences, one of the things I think is just awesome, and I said this at the very beginning of my presentation, is that we are all, not only are we in silos, we're in silos when we work in our own companies, right? We work in little pockets. And one of the things that I think is just hilarious, comical, and I can't get over is, I've attended so many of these all over the place. But you'll be working at some place, and one day there'll be once a year there'll be like an innovation sharing community kind of conference, and all of a sudden you realize that everybody's sharing their work, and like two doors down from you is a team that's working on solving a problem that you've been trying to solve, and they've been working on it for 2 years, and you didn't even know about it. And so that to me is like, it's funny, but it's also extremely frustrating that those things are there. And so my goal is to just get rid of all those proprietary kind of silos as far as sharing information, and also going out to seek help, like going out to different departments and saying, here's what I can offer. What can you offer? And like, so that, with our limited resources, can we get something done where each of us is capitalizing our strengths? You guys got the tech budget and I've got the, instructional design expertise over here. How can we collaborate to, help each other out? Because I know you guys probably need this kind of analysis. Let's say somebody's really tech savvy, but they don't really know how to do a really solid needs analysis, like how to figure out what to actually put in that tech, how to decide what actually gets into the scenario. So you want to collaborate with those people. And one of the things that I find too is, we have our own little world of experts here in North America. And then, Europe has its own set of experts, and Australia and basically, South Africa, they all have pockets of expertise, and there's just, as far as I'm concerned, not enough like cross-pollination, ideas having, sexy time so that they can breed more ideas. And that's what I want to do more of, which is talk to people who are not just, they don't necessarily have to be in a different market, but they're coming with a different perspective because they went to like a completely different country for all of their learning, and they might have a totally different approach, right? So that's what I loved. Where I have people, it's funny because one of the presentation slides that I had this piece of bacon, because I was deconstructing this solid e-learning activity from Michael Allen, or Allen Interactions, and nobody had ever seen it before, which was awesome because I love the fact that this is my world, right? I live in it. I seek out models to deconstruct, and so when I show up to these things, I love the fact that I'm showing people things they have not seen before, because they don't have time to search out these things. This isn't their world, right? They have like 22 different projects going on at the same time. So I love the fact that I can show them something that will excite them and inspire them, because that's what a lot of the things that I think a lot of the things that you see out there that are these front-end products that have been developed by teams, or also things that you see as the pinnacle of, let's say, e-learning design. Like you'll see something like a Haji Kamal, or you'll see something like Broken Coworker, or like Allen Interactions has many fabulous demos. But one of the things I wanted to do is, and I hope I achieved it, is to show people that even though those things look complicated at the outset, and some of them can be quite sophisticated and complicated, that underneath all of those pieces is a common thread, is a pattern. And once you've got that pattern down, then you can decide how much you want to layer over top of it to take it to the next level of engagement. And sometimes what you can do is once you've got the pattern of what a great question is, which is in essence, a lot of these scenarios, once you deconstruct them, are in essence really well-written, multiple choice questions, which is basically where you're presented with a situation and then you get several options to choose from on how to handle it. And then a scenario question, which a lot of people, I think, when they hear multiple choice question, they think that that's a direct application of what a scenario is. No, a scenario takes that the result of your choice, the consequence, and that is what's given to the learner as feedback. And it's not a right or wrong kind of outcome. It shows you what happens as a result of you making that decision, which in some cases is, the cake does not rise because you chose, this sequence of events, or you choose something, like you're presented with a problem, and then you choose a course of action from one of those three choices, and then the outcome is, let's say, somebody 3 months later actually gets hurt or gets their finger lopped off. I always go really graphic because the little lever that you were supposed to close, you missed that. And 3 months later, when somebody accessed it, something fell on them, right? So, and that's another thing that I always talk about with scenarios, which is that scenarios give us the ability not only to practice something in a safe place, and that came up during the presentation that I ran, because I think a lot of people are recognizing that now the consequences have to be realistic, but also pretty amped up, right? You got to have impact. They got to be powerful and emotional. So, and then the other piece is you're helping people practice something dangerous potentially or really troublesome in a safe place, make these decisions to see the outcomes, because seeing the outcome is actually really good for you, right? Failure in that environment is good for you. But the other piece is that ability to compress time. So things that aren't necessarily evident right away, consequences that manifest themselves, let's say 3 months later, those are things that scenarios are really good at as well. And definitely you can show people the consequences of actions that they would actually never even connect to their original action, which is what is fantastic. So one of the other things I talked about, and I mentioned the word mechanics, and I wanted to deconstruct what mechanics actually means. So, and I had to borrow from gameplay. That's why I started talking about this in the first place. I had to borrow from gameplay because games have rules and they have specific language around them that a lot of people have been deconstructing for a very long time. One of the people that has been thinking about how games and learning works has been Carl Kapp. And what is interesting about the game mechanic is that it translates very well into our learning world. So a game mechanic is something that is at the core, drives the activity. So let's say a game mechanic for chess is you taking pieces and moving them around on a board. And that's it. That's the game mechanic. The game mechanic for Dance Revolution, let's say, if you've ever played that game, which is, by the way, super awesome because you actually learn a skill. So Dance Revolution, if you don't know what that is you're standing in front of a computer with an Xbox attached to it. It can see where all your limbs are. It shows you things on the screen as far as dance moves, and you're supposed to mimic the person, and then you have a dance off with a robot. And you get all this coaching and feedback while you're doing it. But the dance mechanic is you following a rhythm and following following a pattern, right? Being able to match your movement to the movement of that doll that's playing on the screen. Very simple. That's all it is. The game could be just that. Let's say with the game mechanic with most board games is you rolling dice and based on that dice roll, moving your piece forward or whatever on squares. That's like 90% of board games, right? So then what happens is, so that's mechanics. And believe it or not, most scenarios, most e-learning out there that's engaging and action-driven, and when I say action-driven, I mean that the learner is in charge of moving the story forward through decisions that they have to make. So when you think about something that is very much question or action-driven, you want to look at something like, for example, a very simple example of this is the platform for language learning called Duolingo. So Duolingo, the way they've designed their learning of languages, they actually do not use any kind of necessarily instruction manual. They don't teach you language in the way that you'd perceive, which is reading a bunch of stuff in a dictionary and then trying to figure out how to apply that. They ask you to learn that language through a series of questions. And the questions have visuals attached, sounds attached, dialogue attached, and there's always this helpful framework underneath, but it is entirely user-driven. And that's probably what makes Duolingo one of the most successful language learning platforms in the world. I will say that. And also, it's free. If you haven't checked out Duolingo just for the aspect of how they use questions to drive engagement and other things that they've built around it, then I highly suggest you do, because it is one of the things that we need to do as people who design e-learning scenarios, is to experience good scenarios so that when we go back to the work that we put out, we can be actually a little more reflective of that work and be able to deconstruct it and be a little bit more critical of it, because we now know what a good experience is like. Although that's very tough sometimes to do, but it's better to have those experiences than not. And there's the people that I know that are really good at designing scenarios for others. Those are people who consistently force themselves to either play games. There's many narrative-driven games now online and even in the App Store that are free that you need to check out so that you understand these mechanics, because, like I said, this is a world that is able to actually inform our design if we let it, if we deconstruct it and use it for our purposes, right? So one of the things that when you think about game mechanics and these patterns, what are some patterns that apply to e-learning scenarios? And I find that if you actually look at most sophisticated e-learning scenarios out there, there is only 4 types of game mechanics. And the mechanics are questions. And the types of questions you probably find quite familiar because you probably have taken a test sometime in your life, either in elementary school or high school, or university. And the question types are true and false, right? Is this true or is this false? Is a statement true or false? Multiple choice question, which I just described, which is, here's a statement, which one of these answers is correct? There's the multiple select question, which is, here's a situation, what are 1 or 2 things that are accurate either about the statement or who's giving this person the best advice. I use that activity a lot, but a multiple choice question or multiple select question is when you can choose more than one option is correct, and you're asking people to. It's a great mechanic actually, and I'll talk about it more in future design discussions. Then there's the other one, which I also find very interesting, is the alternate choice question, which somebody during the during the presentation, I actually had somebody say that they didn't know what an alternate choice question was, which is you're presented with a situation. An alternate choice means you only have two options. So it's a little different than true or false, because when you have an alternate choice question, both options look extremely valid. And so you are working on, it's take action or not take action. So it's not that a statement is true or false. There's actually a lot of great dynamic scenarios out there, especially video-driven ones that have this quick take action or not action, because there are some places where video actually enhances how immediate a situation is. So if you're, let's say, doing something that's time sensitive, giving people an option to act or not act, pick up the hammer or pick up the scalpel, whatever, right? What happens is those are great for that quicker the decision in the moment when time is very tight and you don't have time to necessarily reflect on a lot of options and think about them. That's a great pattern to use. So if you're teaching somebody CPR, that might be a good one, like press on their chest or give them breath. 5 breaths or whatever it is, right? So it's a really another awesome pattern, which I went into deeply as well, because I deconstructed a specific scenario that only used that as a mechanic. And so what happens is, so now let's say you've got this pattern, and I have to tell you, just because a lot of people ask me this question and they reach out to me when we're coaching, and they'll say things like, I don't know where to start, or things are I get lost down the rabbit hole of options. And I totally understand that. I've been there. But I have to tell those people, and I'm telling you right now, 95% of the time, a multiple choice question, the structure of that, you can use that to design all of your scenarios. And I start with that until I am proven that there is something special that needs to happen, that needs to adopt a different pattern. So if something is maybe more time sensitive and there is maybe a life or death situation at stake, let's say that we're designing the e-learning for, if I know that up front, I might go with the alternate choice question, which is, take action or not take action, use this tool or use this tool. It's very dynamic and drives the scenario forward. However, like I said, most e-learning scenarios are about decision making, and you have more than 6 seconds to make a decision. So those usually work well with a multiple choice question where there's one option to move forward. So one of the things that happens after you've got that pattern set up is, like with most games, now you're adding elements around it that add context and challenge. Now in games, those might be things like certain moves, or landing on a certain piece makes it worth more, so you move forward a little bit further. Or like with Monopoly, it's a board game, but what they do is they add things like, if you land on these particular squares 3 times, then you get maybe the property, and if you collect these 3, then you get to charge more, and it enhances the gameplay. There's some squares that you land on them and they happen to give you money. Some squares you land on them and they happen to make you draw from the middle of the board so you get a special lucky card. So those are all what we call game space. So what happens is, what's wonderful is you can take that original pattern of, let's say, a board game or a multiple choice question, and then put it in a different game space. And what happens is it's able to fill its purpose without actually you needing to reinvent the wheel, because the pattern is there. And so a lot of people are when they get in touch with me, they're a little confused about, how can I work with Sony? How can I work with Adidas? How can I work with ABB? How can I work with, let's say, NRC? How do you get from these, like, how come you're able to transition to all these different industries? How come you're able to design learning for people who are, let's say, selling for a multinational company that is selling specific widgets and maybe lasers for testing the levels of water in cisterns versus tires versus shoes versus people who are trying to learn leadership skills? How can you transition from soft skills to shoes? How can you do that? Because there is a pattern. And the pattern, once you discover what it is and you are strict with yourself about starting with that pattern, not trying to start from a blank space because that gets you in trouble. And you realize that once that pattern is, you figured it out through some analysis and some thinking about it and maybe testing out the different models, which are only 4 really. I mean, true or false, I rarely use that one. There are a couple of times when it's useful, but I can talk about that in a different podcast. But anyways, the point is, once you get the pattern figured out and you drop that ego and you're walking to this place and say, listen, I've got the pattern, help me, give me the top performers, give me the experts in the field, give me the practitioners, and I can now add the gameplay, the context. Boom. I can go anywhere. I can work with anyone because I have a pattern. And that's one of the things that is beautiful about the jobs that we do is, and I said that also during the presentation, we are chameleons. We are people who are, not only do we design learning for people to make their lives better, which is like so amazing that you can actually do that. You can actually have impact on thousands and thousands and thousands of people, right? But to have that and also be able to say, okay, if I've got the pattern, I can work in any industry anytime. And I've been so happy that I've been able to do this and grow from those experiences and realize that there's probably like chicken and egg, right? I'm moving from place to place, working with these different clients, and all of a sudden I'm like, wow, we actually have these patterns and they keep on reappearing, and I come back to them and they are solid. Why mess with them? Use that pattern, and then it's the gameplay that becomes the flavor of that specific workplace, that becomes the flavor of that specific intent. So, what are some opportunities for creating that awesome game space, right? And so game space, like I just said, are all those details that you add that add context. And one of the things that I like to do when I design scenarios is to figure out, and this happens iteratively. This isn't something like when you're drafting your scenario that you figured it out at the very front. It's just something that you keep in your mind as you're talking to people, as you're testing this, to see what are some elements that you need to wrap your scenario in that will help make it more realistic to your learner. But you're not trying to do reality, okay? Like, we are still clicking a mouse. So it is about decisions. All of our scenarios are about decision making. And I never want to get away from that. Like, we're trying to help people make better decisions in the moments. And so the gameplay pieces, or the game space pieces, are the things that you add that when somebody is now going into their workplace or the place where they're going to apply what you just help them apply in the scenario, that some of those triggers and cues that you used, whether they're visual or auditory, that they in some way are able to make that connection to the real world. It may not be super explicit because the real world is full of things that overwhelm you, stress you out. There's people, emotions, all those things, self-doubt, everything is in there. You are working with so many elements, right? But the way you set your game space for in that scenario can actually be helpful for that person to practice certain things. So I deconstructed several scenarios, but there are some elements that would help somebody maybe make the scenario a little more interesting for them. So one of the things that happens that you don't realize that how powerful it is sound. So adding, and if you go to Duolingo and actually practice, you'll notice that the sound for positive reinforcement versus negative reinforcement, as in when you get something right versus when you get something wrong, the way that's done, super strategic. Just listen to the way that they do those sounds. They're fantastic. And that in itself is one actually game space mechanic or game space element that absolutely reinforces and makes me want to get the answer right again. So that's very superficial, but it works. Another game mechanic is a timer. So in some ways, I deconstructed several skill-based scenarios, and the skill-based scenarios, like let's say one of them was working in a kitchen. Well, you can't take 4 hours to put together bacon and eggs, right? So what the idea is that, let's say in the very beginning, you have 5 minutes to put together a meal. And then as you get better, the time gets shorter. Or maybe the time doesn't get shorter, you still get 5 minutes. But what happens is your orders start stacking and you get more requests in a busy kitchen. So what happens is you have to get more efficient at organizing your time, right? At organizing the way you're going to put those meals together to be able to release one every 5 minutes on time, 5 minutes after you got that order. So that's when a timer becomes actually really relevant. A timer would not be relevant in, let's say, a social situation where I maybe get to think about some things because it's not realistic, right? So your game space becomes, in some ways, a little bit of a manifestation of what the real world is like, with some challenge and games built in. So it doesn't, you are compressing time, so it's different. When time really matters, boom, that's a great indication for somebody to even know if they're meeting the criteria, especially when time is of the essence. Another piece is of game space. Like, let's say you want to enhance something like the consequences by actually showing something really graphic, or the outcome, which is very powerful, right? So your question could be in text, and then your consequence could be like a truck crushing into a wall, or somebody 6 months later having stuff fall on them because you didn't latch something properly. So that could be a game space enhancement. Another one could be, this was used quite extensively. I remember it's in certain, when you're dealing with certain people, like let's say you're dealing with sales scenarios, and I've seen this used so many times that I've used it myself. So what happens is, and you probably think of the context that might work for you. If you're dealing with somebody, you're trying to, let's say, persuade them of something like to purchase a set of tires, then based on how the kinds of questions you ask that person, the kinds of ways that you respond, the features, let's say, that you share in that scenario, each one of those options that you choose is attached to, let's say, a score. It's attached to a value. And as you choose the right kinds of options from your multiple choice question, that value increases. And so what you can do is you can actually structure that value to feed into a motivation meter. And what the motivation meter does is it tells you how motivated the person is, let's say, to buy those tires. And also, it can be a really great in-the-moment type of feedback piece for people who are novices at selling, because they can immediately see, without going, they can immediately see that some questions or some approaches are better than others, because motivation changes based on their selection. So it's a great just in the moment kind of feedback. And one of the other ways that I showed in the presentation that a motivation meter can be used is there was a really great scenario done by Allen Interactions for Kaiser Permanente, and it was for doctors. And the scenario was that you'd have all these people come in, and the people they were overweight, and the goal was for that doctor to, in 15 minutes, which is so intense, right? 15 minutes, supposed to get them motivated enough through a series of questions, a very structured process. You were supposed to get those people to agree to take some action on their weight. Tall order, right? And I thought about how that's kind of what we're asked to do a lot of times. We're supposed to have people commit to something that's a really fundamental change and a shift in their mindset in 15 minutes, right? So we're not alone, guys. Everybody's trying to do this. We are all under tight constraints. But what was great is the same thing happened. This Kaiser Permanente, and do look for it, Allen Interactions Kaiser Permanente scenario. It's fantastic. And you get lost in it. But then after you get lost in it, go back and deconstruct it. Basically a series of multiple choice questions with several key mechanics wrapped up in this fabulous game space, right? So the game space, they also added a motivation meter. And so the motivation meter was attached to the kinds of questions that the doctor asked to get the patient's buy-in to take action on their weight. And you could see, it's very linear. It's a very linear progression, which actually works. But what it gives you an indication right away is, based on the way I'm asking these questions, is this person going to walk away motivated to actually take action? And it's fabulous, because the thing is, when you're a doctor and this person is in front of you, they're not gonna walk out. You have 15 minutes. So the scenario is realistic that way, because for 15 minutes, or however long, it doesn't actually take 15 minutes, but you have this span of this 15 minutes to talk to this person, and whether you're doing great or not, they're going to be with you for that time. So it's in some cases, it's actually pretty painful, because you can actually see what that person is thinking versus what they're saying. And what's wonderful is that they realize that maybe doctors or people will say that they'll take action, but if it's a little too early in the conversation and you haven't gotten the right kind of commitments, then people will say whatever they think you want to hear, so that you leave them alone. And so one of the things that I think was really great in there is that somebody would say something, the consequence to one of my questions as a doctor, the consequence was that person telling me, yeah, okay, sure, I'll do that. I'll eat less cookies. And then what it would also show you at the same time is what they were thinking. And a lot of times, if you're not going down the right path, the person might be saying one thing and thinking another. Sometimes they're honest, sometimes they're not. So that was a fabulous game space addition that made it very interesting, and in fact gave them, the doctor, whoever's practicing, a little bit of a great advantage in there that they could then hopefully take with them as a lesson and apply it in the real world. It was a fantastic scenario. And what's great is, once it's set up, this is like rinse, repeat, right? Now, I've set it up. I have this string of multiple choice questions with all these consequences. This pattern is all set up. I added this game space, which does these things. I have a motivation meter. I have some coaching feedback for the person. I have this special bubble that shows what they're actually thinking. So those are all the elements. And guess what? Then I can take and plop in another person with different challenges, different goals, different ways to motivate them, and I just insert that into the pattern and I repeat it over and over again. Does it get boring? Not at all. In fact, one of the things that happens when you repeat patterns like that, and this is what I think we all have to internalize, is that we like to create novelty for people. And novelty only goes so far. If your context is great, does not matter, because after a while, you get so comfortable with the pattern and the interface, right? All you start focusing on as a learner is how to get this challenge right. You don't care about the fact that you're looking at another person in the same space and you're asking them, maybe the questions are a little bit changed, but now you're trying to find the pattern that will get you success. So what's wonderful is the anxiety of working with the interface falls away and you can focus on the task. And that's one of the things you have to think about for your learners is, are you adding complexity where none is required? There's no need for you to change that. If that interface, there's no need for you to add magic surprises when none are needed. You can add that delight and that happiness that somebody feels from the satisfaction by giving them maybe great feedback. But the activity has been repetitive, and that's okay. How many times have you played Monopoly or any other game? You love the idea that you understand it, and now you're focused on the challenge of making it work for you. And that's an awesome scenario, is when all that other complexity falls away, you know what you're doing, and you can focus on making the right decisions. That's what makes it awesome. So I hope you found that helpful. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, let me know. You know how you let me know? You write a review. Like, tell me how I'm doing. Or leave me a comment about how you are using these strategies. Are you finding the patterns? Are you finding those patterns for yourself? Because man, it makes your life so much more easier, because then you can focus on the stuff that you're good at, which is like, trying to get all those juicy details and consequences from that subject matter experts or top performers' head and getting those into the scenarios so people can actually get value from that 15 to 30 minutes that they're spending working through that scenario. So, hope you're revved up, ready to go, and ready to create some awesome e-learning scenarios. And I will talk to you next time, my friend. Have a wonderful rest of the day.
You're listening to the eLearning Scenario Design Podcast with Anna Zabramowitz.